Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, video 23, still working our way through chapter 5. In this video, there are I've broken it down into 4 parts: the clear and the confused. Then we'll talk about depth and distance, then explication and differentiation with a C, just looking at the difference between those two. And then we'll finish up with a little bit on entropy. So the first part of our video, clear, confused. So if you remember from way back in this series, in the middle of the series somewhere, we talked about distinctness and clarity in the idea. And the basic idea with that was that the more distinct an idea is, the less clear it is. And the reason for that was because distinctness referred to how differentiated with a T the idea was, or the relations within the idea were. And so that refers to the virtuality of the idea. And clarity refers to when an idea is differentiated with a C, so actualization. So the clearer an idea is, the more actualized it is. And with those two definitions of distinctness and clarity on the table, then it allows Deleuze to say the more distinct an idea is, the less clear. Or vice versa, the clearer an idea is, the less distinct it is. And it just turned on the understanding of, or the definition of distinct referring to the virtuality of an idea, and clarity referring to its actualization. And here he changes those terms a bit. Maybe he did earlier in the book as well, but I didn't catch it. We talked about distinctness and clarity. Here he talks about distinctness and obscurity. So just kind of like giving us the negative of clarity, giving it a word instead of saying unclear, it's obscure. So we can say then, the more distinct an idea is, i.e. the more virtual it is, the more obscure it is, i.e. the less actualized. And that's important because it kind of correlates with this notion of clear, confused, or this pairing of clarity and confusion. And the clear, confused, instead of referring to the idea like the distinct, obscure, it refers to the individual and individuation. So let me give you a quote. Each intensity clearly expresses only certain relations or certain degrees of variation. Those that it expresses clearly are precisely those on which it is focused when it has the enveloping role. In its role as the enveloped, it still expresses all relations in all degrees, but confusedly. The clear and the confused as logical characteristics in the intensity which expresses the idea, in other words, in the individual which thinks it, are no more separable than the distinct and the obscure are separable in the idea itself. The clear confused as individuating intensive unit corresponds to the distinct obscure as ideal unit. Clear confused does not qualify the idea, but the thinker who thinks or expresses it. The thinker is the individual. So there's a few things I wanted to pull out from that quote. First of all, just to be clear, we're talking about individuation here. So when Deleuze says each intensity clearly expresses certain relations or certain degrees of variation, that's individuation, right? That's the process of individuation. Individuation is intensive, and this individuating process clearly and confusedly expresses certain relations and degrees of variation. Now, we need to talk about these terms enveloping and enveloped. we've talked about them before as well. It can never hurt to go over them again, because just to really get a feel for what they are. And it's important to understand this idea of clear confused. So as enveloping, intensity clearly expresses relations and degrees of variation. So enveloping, when the process of individuation is taking place, when individuation happens, the relations and degrees of variation within the idea are clearly expressed. And that is intensity in its enveloping role. And so I kind of think of this like a blueprint. And the intensity as enveloping gives a general direction for the process of individuation, for the individual, which is going to be individuated. And it's clear, as enveloping intensity clearly expresses these relations, because it's kind of apparent. It's the field of individuation is I want to say visible, but that's too metaphorical perhaps. But it's there. That is what is readily apparent. This, and I'm kind of talking about it as if we're looking at it from the outside, which is not the case, because this is all happening from the point of view of the individual, right? So it's taking place within the idea itself. But it's clear because that field is that field of individuation is there. It's I mean, the points that make it up, or rather, that field is nothing more than the points that make it up. So there's no hiddenness. There's nothing that's concealed in this field of individuation, which is intensity as enveloping. As enveloped, on the other hand, intensity expresses those relations and degrees of variation confusedly. And so this, if we think of the enveloping as this general blueprint, this picture giving us a direction for the individuation, intensity as enveloped is the specific distances between those different parts within the field of individuation, within intensity as enveloping. The enveloped is the distances, or another word maybe is the intensive quantities themselves, the specifics, the details of how the individual is going to be individuated. So you've kind of got the bigger picture, if you like, with intensity as enveloping, and you've got the details with intensity as enveloped. And the former is clear because it's just what it is. It is the parts of which it's comprised, the parts that make up this field of individuation. And again, imagine something tangible like an egg, which is a field of individuation. The parts that make it up, or the intensity as enveloping, is nothing more than those parts. There is nothing extra to know here. So it's clear in that sense, but the specific distances between them and the way that those are going to be expressed is something that's not apparent. It's something that isn't. There's a hidden depth there that can't be ascertained, that isn't clear, that it's something that you don't. I'm using the word know, but obviously I'm not talking about specific knowledge. explicit knowledge, but it's something that can't be known until the process is played out. It's buried within that field of individuation. So you don't know exactly. It's not clear. It's confused. There's no specific. It's too specific. I feel like I'm not explaining that very well. When you have the field of individuation, that is nothing more than the parts that make it up. But the distances, intensity as enveloped, isn't just there in the parts. It's in the relations between the parts. And that is not apparent. There's an extra depth to what is just apparent, which is the field of individuation. And so in that sense, that's what Deleuze means when he says these are confusedly expressed, because they're hidden underneath. It's the details that are locked away within or beneath the points themselves, the different parts themselves within that field of individuation. You don't know. You can't see them. They're not apparent. They're not clear, because they have to be worked out in order to become apparent. So intensity as enveloping clearly expresses the relations, whereas intensity as enveloped confusedly expresses those relations. And it's nice that way of thinking about, that imagery of thinking about the egg, I think, is quite helpful, because it lets us understand, I think, what Deleuze was getting at with these words enveloping and enveloped. Enveloping, it's like that immersed, encompassing field. That's the egg. And the enveloped are the specific distances within the parts that make up that field. So those terms sound a lot more tangible now, right? Hopefully. And just expanding on this idea, Deleuze goes on to say that two individuals, even those belonging to the same species, never have the same field of individuation. While two individuating intensities may be abstractly the same by virtue of their clear expression, they are never the same by virtue of the order of intensities which they envelop or the relations which they confusedly express. So two individuating intensities may be abstractly the same by virtue of their clear expression. This is intensity as enveloping. This is what I call the blueprint. And it's kind of like, think of it maybe as formal. Gives the general broad outline. And this is the same for different members of the same species, because it is that blueprint. It is, and this is why Deleuze says it's abstract. They're abstractly the same because you don't get any details. It's just a broad picture, broad outline. But that's why it's clear, because it gives you that kind of mold, if you like, which the individual is going to fit into. But the enveloped, however, are the specific quantities. So these are, as Deleuze says, the order of intensities which this field envelops. And this is like the content to the form of the blueprint, the details. And this is different in individual members, even of the same species. And this is where individual differences come about in the process of individuation, when those, the the blueprint's the same, the form is the same, the field of individuation is the same, but the specific distances between different parts, the relations that make up the different the relations that exist between the parts within that field of individuation are different, and they're expressed in different ways, even amongst individuals even of the same species. And this is why that's confused. It's no longer clear. It only becomes the individual becomes what it is going to be only once the process of individuation has happened. And exactly how that individual is going to form isn't clear until the process has been worked out. Okay, so that was the first point. Was it the first point? Maybe it was the second one. Anyway, another point I want to pull out of that quote is where Deleuze says that the clear and the confused aren't separable in the individual which thinks it. And two things to note about that. First, clear and confused are inseparable. The relations expressed in the individual are always both clear and confused, so that they come together. And the other thing I wanted to address is where Deleuze says the individual which thinks it. So he talks about clear confused does not qualify the idea, but the thinker who thinks or expresses it. And the thinker is the individual. Now, thinking, this is not cognition, right? He's not an idealist. He's not a panpsychist. He's not claiming that consciousness is bedrock or anything like that. It's just the way that Deleuze writes, and the way he employs different metaphors to talk about things. So thinking, it's not related to consciousness or cognition. And he even goes on to say that everybody, everything thinks and is a thought, to the extent that, reduced to its intensive reasons, it expresses an idea, the actualization of which it determines. So thinking there for Deleuze, as he's using the word, means nothing more than an individuating intensity which expresses an idea. That's what thinking is in this context. And it's actually really nice. It's a nice inclusion here, despite the fact that it can be confusing, and it would be easy to read Deleuze as an idealist or as something along those lines, panpsychist or whatever. But he's not. If you read Deleuze carefully, I think it's clear that he isn't doing those things. Remember, we talked about the idea as metaphysical, not as something that a human being thinks, right? Not as cognition. Same thing here. So the idea is understood in this metaphysical sense, and if that's the idea, when the idea is expressed, that's what we call thinking, right? In normal parlance, we would say thinking is expressing an idea. And that's exactly how Deleuze has set this up, so that, but we just have a different concept of idea. Idea is metaphysical, not as something a human being does, an act of cognition. Idea is metaphysical when the idea is expressed, keeping that analogy running, keeping the metaphor running. That is what it is to think. And so thinking is the expressing of an idea. So I just wanted to be clear about that. When he talks about the word, when he uses the word thinking and thought here, he's not drifting into panpsychism or idealism or anything like that. And he even says right at the end there, where does he say it? The thinker is the individual. And the individual, as we know, we've talked about, is an example of an individual is an embryo. And an embryo is not performing any acts of cognition. It's not having actual thoughts the way that we typically understand that word. So when he says the clear and the confused aren't separable in the individual which thinks it, he just means the clear and confused aren't separable in the individual which expresses the idea. Nice. The last thing I wanted to mention is the connection actually between clear, confused and distinct, obscure, which I talked about right at the beginning. The clear, confused as individuating intensive unit corresponds to the distinct, obscure as ideal unit. So the important point there is that the clear and confused relate to individuation, and distinct, obscure relate to the idea. Clear, confused relate to thought, if you like, keeping the metaphor running. Distinct, obscure relate to the idea itself. And it's not quite a perfect parallel, because with the distinct, obscure and the idea, we had the connect. There was like a degree. The more distinct the idea was, the more obscure it was. In other words, the more differentiated, the more virtual the idea was, the less actualized it was by necessity, and vice versa. So there was this kind of sliding scale where you could talk about degrees a little bit. Whereas here, all Deleuze is saying is that the relations expressed by intensity in individuation are always expressed both clearly and confusedly. So there's no like the more of one, the less of the other, or the more and the more. There's no kind of connection in that way. It's just that within individuation, the relations are always expressed both clearly and confusedly. All right, we must be moving into the second part of the video, depth and distance. So depth and distance, these words have come up before, but it's just good. It's nice to go over them again because they acquired a little bit more clarity for me as I was reading this section. And also the words enveloping, enveloped come in again, which again just gives us more points of attack on these terms, so we can flesh out, get the ideas clear in our minds. So I've got a quote for you. The basic idea here is that we're just describing individuation in terms of the enveloping and the enveloped. The enveloping intensities, depth, constitute the field of individuation, the individuating differences. The enveloped intensities, distances, constitute the individual differences. The latter necessarily fill the former. So we kind of covered a lot of this in the last section, but like I say, it's always good for me, if not for you, to just go over these again. Enveloping intensities as depth. So this is what depth is, and depth was a word that maybe wasn't quite pinpointed or nailed down, I think, earlier. So enveloping intensities are depth, and they constitute the field of individuation, that which individuates. So depth is intensity, but it's just intensity as enveloping, as this field of individuation. The enveloped intensities, on the other hand, are distance. And distance constitutes the individual differences to be individuated. So we've almost got this, and I think I have talked about it in these terms before, a difference of active and passive. enveloping is I think I've called it the catalyst, catalyzing force. And now we have this other picture of an encompassing field. And the enveloped are those specific distances, the specific, the details, if you like, that make up that field, the intensive quantities that define the relations between parts within this field. Those are the actual differences that are individuated, whereas the enveloping intensities, the depth, is that catalyzing force. And that's kind of how I've understood depth and distance. Depth is enveloping. It's like a gradient between elements. It gives, and the metaphor I think of here is height. So it kind of establishes a distance. It establishes a difference between parts within this field. But in establishing difference, all it does is set up the field itself, because that's all the field is. The field of individuation is just the parts, and the parts set up different in relation to each other. So when I say I think of it as like height. It gives different parts, it sets them up at different heights, if you like. And the reason I think of height is because it gives us this natural sense that there's potential for change. Because now, if everything's flat, nothing can change, right? Nothing will happen. But if you get differences in height, one thing can now reduce. One thing has to be, there's a difference that can be cancelled, and that's what generates. That's that catalyzing force, gives us some potential for something to happen. So depth is kind of like this setting up of height within a field of individuation. It's what a field is. Distance, then, as the enveloped, is instead of just kind of indexing heights of different parts within this field, it gives us specific details of how far apart, if you like, these points are, what the relation is between these specific points. So again, it's like the details of how, if there's a difference to be cancelled through height, then the distance is the specific height, in terms of numbers, if you like, that will bring about that difference. So it just gives us the content to the form. Distance is the content to the form of depth. I think I used that in the last section. It's a rough metaphor, but it works for me anyway. And he also says at the very end there, the latter necessarily fill the former. So the enveloped intensities fill the enveloping intensities, the distances fill the depth, which again makes sense within the way I think the imagery I've been using to talk about these terms. You've got a field, an enveloping field, and it's just made up of the differences. It's made up of the distances. It's made up of the enveloped. So in that sense, the enveloped fill out the enveloping. The distances fill out the depth. The intensive quantities fill out the field of individuation. Okay, that's enough on that. Let's move to talk about explication and differentiation. So I wanted to start this with a quote, and then we'll just flesh it out. Again, just trying to pin down these terms: explication, differentiation. Intensity creates the extensities and the qualities in which it is explicated. these extensities and qualities are differentiated. So explication is the process in which intensity creates the extensities and the qualities in which the idea is actualized. Fine. Do we need to say anything more? So the extensities are formally distinct, Deleuze goes on to say. They comprise the distinctions between parts corresponding to distinctive points. So again, like parts, the field of individuation itself, or points within that field, which I've already said, and are the field itself. There's nothing more to the field than that. So extensities are formally distinct. It's just the distinctions between parts. Qualities, on the other hand, Deleuze says, are materially distinct, and these comprise distinctions corresponding to the variations of relations. And this is species, as opposed to parts of extensities. And this is the relations between the points, as opposed to the field of individuation itself. So we have a very similar distinction going on here to the one that we saw earlier with regards to enveloping and enveloped, depth and distance. Same idea. And I think this carries through. It's deliberate. The depth is explicated as extensity, and distance is explicated as quality. So that's it's quite tidy. You see this a lot when you go through Deleuze in this kind of depth. Different parts of his philosophy they interlock with other parts so tidily, so neatly. I've commented on it before, but it's just another example of it. All of the ideas just line up they line up really nicely. Okay, so that's explication, the process in which intensity creates extensities and qualities. Differentiation, on the other hand, refers to the particular form the extensities and qualities in which the idea is actualized take, and is distinct from other potential lines of actualization. So we have talked about this before. It's kind of a difference in actualization instead of a difference in the idea. And this is exactly how we've talked about it before. It's the difference between differentiation with a T and differentiation with a C. Differentiation is that it's a difference, but on the side of actualization. And the difference that it captures is a difference between other potential or possible lines of actualization that could come about. So an actualized concrete entity is differentiated from other potential actualized concrete entities that it could have become instead. And this gives us a nice link to creation as well, which Deleuze defines as the production of lines and figures of differentiation with a C by intensity or individuation in which actualization takes place. So that's what creation is. That's where creativity arises, is in the actualization, and in the fact that actualization could have taken another form, could have involved the production of different lines and different figures. It could have involved different extensities, different qualities, but it took this specific line, and that, because that line is what was actualized instead of these other potential lines, that's what creativity is. That's what creation is in this process of actualization of ideas. Okay, and this means the last section. We're at the last section, which is entropy. So we've talked about entropy a few times in this chapter, but there's just this is just a nice cap on this whole discussion, I think. So I'll give you the quote and then we'll break it down. Empirical principles tend to leave out the elements of their own foundation. The principle of degradation, entropy, obviously does not account either for the creation of the most simple system or for the evolution of systems. The living therefore testifies to the existence of another order, a heterogeneous order of another dimension. So entropy on the empirical plane, I called it. Deleuze doesn't call it that, but considered as an empirical feature from an empirical perspective, cannot account for creation or evolution. Therefore, we have to assume another order, another heterogeneous order, an order based in difference. And we've talked about that before. The point that I wanted to pull out here, though, is that Deleuze, and everything that we've said, Deleuze doesn't violate the principle of entropy. So he's criticized it from an empirical perspective. Maybe criticize is not the right word. He's identified that we don't get an explanation of entropy through an empirical understanding. We have to go deeper than that. And that's where we move into metaphysics. That's where we talked about difference and broaden intensity and all of those other features that are central to Deleuze's philosophy. And they gave us this bigger picture which allowed us to make sense not only of entropy, but also of how things can emerge, how creation can take place, how living things can evolve in a universe where entropy is the rule. And so expanding that perspective gave us that. But and everything that we've said about difference and intensity, Deleuze hasn't violated the principle of entropy. Because if you do that, your theory is dead in the water, basically. You can't violate a principle of science and expect to come out unscathed. The problem with science is not that it's wrong. The problem is that it's limited in its perspective. It's limited in its scope, as it must be in order to work. But if we want to explain reality, if we want to understand reality, we need to broaden that scope, which doesn't mean including made up stuff, but it means trying to deliver a theory that does account for the reality that we live, that we inhabit, the universe that we live in. And that's what Deleuze has done, but he hasn't violated the principle of entropy. And there are three places which he doesn't break it up like this, but this is how I understand it anyway. There are three domains in Deleuze's thought where we can see that he's adhering to entropy. He hasn't violated it. The first is metaphysical, and this relates then to differentiation with a T. So creation, remember, which is the production of lines and figures of differentiation with a C, or explication, that involves the cancellation of metaphysical difference. So Deleuze's idea of differentiation, T, is the cancelling of difference. In other words, it's a tending to uniformity, which is exactly what the principle of entropy is. So his metaphysics accords with the principle of entropy. The second place is in actualization or differentiation, so with a C. And here, the created, i.e. the actualized reality, is always erased in equilibrium for physical systems or death for biological systems. So whenever something's created, which seems like you have a violation of entropy, right? Because you're increasing order. That order is going to be erased through either a tendency towards equilibrium in physical systems or towards death in biological systems. Again, preserving entropy eventually. There's a temporary increase in order, but it always tends back to that uniformity. And third, in individuation as well. So differentiation with a C always occurs in more general systems, within more general systems, i.e. a pre-personal, pre-individual milieu. And these general systems are differentiated with a C. So local creations, local differentiations, local actualizations, to the extent that they are, as I just said in the last point, to the extent that they are pockets of order, which appear to resist the principle of entropy, they're always compensated for. They always exist only within a greater system, which is still, on the whole, tending towards uniformity. So you've got those three areas, and they're the three main areas of Deleuze's thought, I think, here. The metaphysical of differentiation with a T, the actualization of differentiation with a C, and the individuation, which comes in the middle. And those three domains, those three areas, the principle of entropy is being respected. It's respected by Deleuze's theory, which is important because, as I said, if you violate that theory, you're done for. You've got no credibility at all. And that's us for today. Let's have a look at a summary. So first we looked at the clear confused, and this refers to the way that in individuation, as enveloping, relations and degrees of variation are clearly expressed. This is like, I called it the blueprint. It's formal. It's the same across different members of the same species. It's the field of individuation itself. Then you've got individuation as enveloped, in which the relations and degrees of variation are confusedly expressed. And this is because this relates to the specifics, the content, in relation to the form of the enveloping. And this gives you the difference in specific individuals that belong to the same species, because we're now talking about the specific differences between parts within that field of individuation. So this gave us the idea that every individuation is both clear and confused. And we compared this with the distinct obscure distinction that we made earlier regarding ideas, where ideas are obscure insofar as they are distinct, where obscure meant not actualized, and distinct meant virtual. Then we looked at depth and distance. We talked about depth as enveloping. So I described this with the metaphor of height, and to give us basically just the establishment of the points themselves. It's the field of individuation, and the height gave us that sense that there's potential for something to happen. This was the individuating field, like I said, the field of individuation itself, and distance is enveloped. And so this is the differences that will be individuated. And I describe this by, in contrast to height, by just giving us the quantity, if you like, between separating these different points. And it's that which gives us the individual differences that are going to be individuated within the individual. Too many individuals in that sentence. Then we looked at explication and differentiation. Explication just creates the extensities and the qualities in which the idea is actualized, and differentiation is the way the extensities and qualities are distinct from other potential lines of actualization. So that the two are similar, but they refer to very different things. And finally, we looked at entropy. The first thing we noted was that this can only be explained on a plane deeper than the empirical. So you have to go beyond the empirical to understand both entropy itself and also how creation and the evolution of life forms can take place. And when you do that, you get to difference, which is Deleuze's central idea. But the key point for us here was that difference respects the principle of entropy. It doesn't violate that principle, because if you violate entropy, you are done for. And there were three domains which correspond to the three domains of Deleuze's, the three domains that make up Deleuze's theory, I think. The first is metaphysical, and this was the idea that creation is the cancellation of difference. So you have that difference established already. That's metaphysical bedrock, and creation is simply the cancellation of that difference, the tendency to uniformity, i.e. entropy. Then within the domain of differentiation, and here there's still a tendency to uniformity, because any actualized reality is always dissolved into either equilibrium for a physical system where there's no more potential, or death for a biological system where again there's no more potential. And the last domain was that of individuation, and here entropy is preserved because local differentiations always occur in a broader de-differentiated milieu. And that de-differentiated milieu is that broader field of individuation. And so we have a nice kind of encapsulation of Deleuze's philosophy when we look at how it relates to entropy. Okay, that's us for today. Let me close off there. So hopefully one more video for this chapter, although it's possible that there will be two. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this helped, and I'll see you in the next one.